why are you just saying tent?
Well, I like to use big fancy words, right?
Instead of your menstrual words.
Welcome to the Brothers in Crime podcast.
We are brothers.
We talk about true crime.
We don't take ourselves too seriously.
And you shouldn't either.
In the last episode, we started talking about the trial and conviction of Jennifer Crumbley, the mother of the Oxford High shooter. In this episode, we'll talk about the trial and conviction of the shooter's father, James Crumbley, and their combined sentencing.
With Jennifer convicted, it was James Crumbley's turn to be tried. He was charged with the exact same offenses, 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Bob, what were people following these cases thinking, having seen Jennifer, she got convicted, now with James going to trial? What was there? Was there kind of a public perception or feeling that the parents were sort of on an equal footing, or one was likely more culpable, or, what was the take on that?
Well, the take from Jennifer's trial generally was that James was responsible for securing the weapon, and Jennifer dumped all of that on him during her trial. That, hey, he was supposed to keep that thing locked up. I didn't know where the guns, that wasn't my thing, that was his responsibility. So if the shooter got the gun, it's because James dropped the ball. So I think the general consensus, nobody really, I don't want to say nobody knew, but the vote was kind of split on whether or not she would end up being convicted. But when it came to forecasting James, the father, I think the general consensus was if Jennifer gets convicted, James is going to get convicted.
Yeah, that's kind of, I didn't follow as closely as you did, but that makes sense to me, just knowing that what she said at her trial, having testified, and how that all played out, that tends to make sense. So James' trial started on March 7th, 2024. Again, you got opening statements. The prosecution tells a story about parents who ignore all the signs and that this leads to this shooting at Oxford High School. And then the defense says, James just wasn't aware of how severe his son's mental illness was. So that's sort of again, very similar, same kind of opening arguments or opening statements being put before the jury, in this case, just like Jennifer's.
Well, here's the thing, though, and I did not watch much of James's trial, and I've already explained to you sort of why, because both of these trials began with a lot of testimony about the actual shooting, victims that were there, teachers, detectives. It was very emotional and gut-wrenching and traumatic, and I understand they had to go through all those same things again because new trial, new jury, new defendant. We have to go through all this stuff. But anyway, I ended up missing most of that trial. I was also focusing on some other crime events that were going on. But something that I considered even before his trial began is when Jennifer's putting the responsibility for keeping that gun safe on James. Likewise, I think, whether this is right or wrong or indifferent, I believe people expect the mom to be in tune to what's going on with the kid, whereas you might be a little more forgiving if dad doesn't know the emotional state of the kid at any given point.
Yeah, whether that's fair or not, I think that's...
Right, that's right, wrong, or indifferent.
That's the reality of probably how how that would break out in most houses. Not that that's,
And there are definitely exceptions. There are single dads out there. There are dads who are much closer to their kids in some cases than moms, but generally speaking, mom knows what's going on with the kids.
Right. Yeah, and to your point, so they start out in James' trial, and they have this forensic analyst come on the stand, and he's kind of got the video of everything that happens. There's testimony about that. We don't need to get too detailed into that. But the jury also hears James Crumbley's 911 call. So he calls 911, and he says, I have a missing gun, and my son is at the school where the shooting's taking place, and also says, I think my son took the gun. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle in James's case.
Right. Like I said in the last episode, we talked about as soon as Jennifer and James figured out that the shooting had happened, they were already sort of in a panic, and that panic went into overdrive when James went back to the house, saw the case that the gun had been kept in, but the gun was not there. Then it was like, I can't imagine whether you're a good parent, bad parent, whatever. At that point, when you start to put those clues together, I can't imagine the feeling that would wash over you.
Yeah, and in the previous, when we talked about Jennifer's trial, I remember we said in terms of James' employment that he was a DoorDasher. And I have in my notes here that apparently he started working for DoorDash immediately after the school meeting. Is that fair? So the prosecutor noted that James had not worked for DoorDash that day until after the meeting. So I think what they're getting at is, like, it wasn't like he was out running deliveries all morning. Okay, I got to stop and I'm going to go. It was, he came in for the meeting with the school, and then afterward, then he started, hitting up his deliveries.
Right.
That
Yeah.
sound right?
I think that meeting was something like 10 o'clock in the morning or something.
So not that early anyway.
I think he had been.
Or not that late, I mean.
Right. I think he had been doing DoorDash in the days and weeks before. He had another job, and he got laid off or something. That job ended. I forget what he was doing, but that was something with a higher salary, I believe. And then in the midst of his layoff, he started doing what a lot of people do, which is gig work. Nothing wrong with it. It's a service that's in demand. But yeah.
Yeah. So then, they put on a bunch of other witnesses. Obviously, they have an employee from the gun store who testifies about, the purchase and kind of how that all went, the protocol, that stuff. To me, there was nothing too crazy about that.
Well, except for that they issue a lock with every single gun they sell. And then I believe there was also testimony about the cable lock.
And there
that was provided with the gun, and the cable lock was still in its package unused, which that to me is a little bit of a distraction, smoke and mirrors thing, because if he was using some other kind of lock, that's fine. Then what's it matter that this other lock is still in its wrapper? Other than the state's proving he had the access, he had a means, there's no reason it shouldn't have been locked. Because look, here's this one he never took out of the package. But if there's another one that he's using or supposed to be using, great if he's using it, but if he's not, then
he can't say, well, I didn't know, or I didn't have this thing. And I do have a note here that the witness, goodness, I can't talk. The witness explained the safety lock documentation. So in other words, it wasn't like it was just in the box and he didn't know what that was for. So it sounds like it was pretty clear that he couldn't deny that he at least was aware of that. But like you said, if his plan allegedly was, I'm going to use a gun safe, or I'm going to use this and that and whatever, okay, fine. But in this instance, when your gun ends up being used for what it was used for, you better have a good explanation for that. There was also a testimony from, several law enforcement officers, but one in particular testified about an interview that he conducted with James and Jennifer on the day of the shooting, and the jury watched the video. Apparently, while the video was playing, James was crying at the defense table. And during the cross-exam, the defense pointed out that James said everything seemed to be fine with the shooter, and that he wanted to talk to the police while his wife, Jennifer, didn't want to. And then there was some controversy about James repeatedly saying, "I love you," with his voice raised, as the shooter was confessing to his mother. I don't know if you got anything on that?
No, I remember seeing that video from that room, but as is usually the case, police interrogation room videos are shot on a 1996 Nokia cell phone, it seems like.
I thought they always just put them on VCR tapes.
Yeah, and use the same
VCR
one
tapes,
for
VHS tapes. I can't even talk.
Oh, no, I knew what you meant.
You knew what I meant.
Yeah, I do remember that. I remember that was kind of his thing, but I not enough to dissect it.
Yeah, and so, there's some back and forth too. There's one point where there's some evidence that James had told his son there were people he could talk to during a meeting with school officials that day before the shooting about, this stuff. So I think at least it might have been at the last minute, even if we believe what James had to say. But, he certainly at that point at least was aware that there were some issues. Yeah, they watched footage. They heard from officers. Again, very similar. We detailed pretty extensively the evidence that was put into play that mattered in Jennifer's trial. Now, did James have a firefighter sugar daddy on the side?
I remember hearing some talk about that he had an affair, been having an affair, but nothing as salacious as what was going on here.
Didn't become a focal point of the trial.
No.
Okay, that's fair. And let's see. So I think, we get into maybe what the prosecution would consider their key evidence. They put it in fourth day of the trial. There's this surveillance video that I kind of talked about. Obviously, that has an emotional impact on everybody, the jury for sure. James, while this is being played, apparently just kind of held his head down and wiped his face with tissues while the video was being played.
James was much more emotional on every end of the spectrum than Jennifer was. He showed a lot more emotion just watching the things go down. He showed more emotion when he was, in that interrogation room video where he was with the shooter. And I imagine you're also going to talk about some of those other emotions that were recorded.
Yeah. We're going to get into that. There's some journal entries that came in, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to read those. There's some stuff about, James's son wrote some messages in his journal that they found.
Sure.
They got entered at the trial.
One of the entries says, "I have zero help for my mental problems, and it's causing me to shoot up the bleeping school." Another entry said, "I want help, but my parents don't listen to me, so I can't get any help."
Now, I would think, even if they're unaware of the journal, the fact that he's written, "I want help, but my parents don't listen to me," which, granted, every teenager probably feels like their parents don't listen to them to some extent. But still, that's not helping James's case.
No, it's not, because if you take this and, they didn't bring in the shooter in either of these trials.
Mm-hmm. My understanding was he refused to testify, and the judge, knowing that his lawyers had said he would not testify, based on that, the judge was not going to bring somebody in who was going to plead the fifth and refuse, which I thought was kind of interesting, because you would think that the state would do an immunity agreement, and then, given everything that happened, he'd already been convicted. You think they'd give an immunity agreement for any other crimes, and then the judge could charge him as a witness with, okay, you have to testify, and then he would be in contempt of court if he didn't. So I do think it's kind of strange that I wonder why that didn't go further the way it did, unless, and this is a wrinkle that I haven't researched, so I can't speak to it, but I believe he was still a minor at the time of these trials, and I don't know if that plays into it at all, where, maybe.
Well, if you could be charged and convicted and sentenced as an adult, you ought to be able to be examined as an adult. I thought he had turned 18 by this point.
And he may have. May have.
And as far as, one thing I see is, the judge can force him to talk or say, "I'm going to hold you in contempt." What kind of punishment does that yield?
Well,
he's already locked up forever.
No, I get that. And at the end of the day, maybe that's it. If he's not going to talk, there's no point in bringing him in there to sit and say he's not going to talk.
But, he could have answered some of the questions when the parents are trying to explain that we knew this or we didn't know that. I don't know if he could have been a good witness for the defense or the state, because we certainly would like to know, these things that are written in the journal, like you said, even if the parents didn't know about it, he's making the assertion in these journal entries that he is actively asking for help and being denied.
Yeah.
So I sure would like to know, how did you ask for help?
Well, and to your point, though, I could see where both sides, you don't know what you're going to get with this guy. And he's got lawyers, he's in custody, whatever else. So you put him on the stand, and maybe he goes all kinds of sideways. And so you think, you know what, I'd rather just leave those questions out there for the jury than to have him come in and blow up my case.
That's true, because he obviously isn't very mentally stable given his crime. But and then what?
And like you said, he's got nothing to lose. So,
but what does that mental instability? Who does that help? In one way, it could help the defense, because you could say, yeah, he wrote this stuff, but we didn't know. He never told us, even though he says he needed help. He's nuts, and we didn't know it. On the other hand, the state could use that and say, if he wrote this, even if he didn't actively reach out as he says he did, clearly someone that's nuts enough to do what he's doing and write this stuff, how could they not see that in their own home?
Yeah, and I could just see where that's like, hey, you know what? That's just a ball of wax we don't want to mess with. But something that I noted in this case that came out was interesting was photos of the shooter's bedrooms. I note that apparently there's two. That they're both messy, and there's like these human silhouettes over his bed. There's empty shell casings that are kind of all over the room, and an empty whiskey bottle.
It was a 2-bedroom house they were living in at the time, and it was a shithole. And I think at one point, wasn't he actually sleeping in the parents' room or something? Because the other room was so packed with shit, you couldn't get in there or some. It was nasty. I mean, I understand. Like, this lady was busy with her horses and her boy toy and her job. And, occasionally.
She might have had horses, too.
Yeah, occasionally doing some of his kids. She didn't have time to clean up. And the husband, well, he was busy not locking up his guns and running his DoorDash. He didn't have time to clean up or anything. I don't know. Well, the defense attorney did explain that in her, Jennifer's defense attorney explained that Jennifer was going to clean up in preparation for the Christmas holiday.
Oh, that makes
and
sense.
just hadn't gotten to it.
Well, didn't she talk about how messy her house was because she's too busy too?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Little empty whiskey bottles and shell casings in her kids' rooms too. I guess.
Right.
Oh, my goodness. Anyway. So, yeah, his defense says, well, he never saw any of these journal entries. He didn't know about this stuff. It's basically what you would expect, right? He sort of says, well, I just didn't know. I was unaware. But the prosecutor says that these deaths that happened were preventable and foreseeable if James Crumbley had done any number of tragically small efforts. That's a quote. Tragically small efforts. The defense attorney shot back that to the jury that the state hadn't proven the case. That there's no evidence to show that James knew that his son was a danger to the public or that he had access to the gun. On the fifth day of the trial, the jury in this case, which again was 6 men and 6 women, it doesn't always happen that way, but that's interesting that in both of these cases it was dead even. The jury began deliberations to decide the fate of James Crumbley and whether he had failed to store his firearm and reasonably prevented his son from gaining access to it. The jury deliberated for about 10 hours before reaching their verdict, and they found James guilty on all counts, all 4 involuntary manslaughter charges. Now, before we go any further, let me share exactly what must be proven to obtain an involuntary manslaughter conviction in Michigan. So generally, these elements are kind of laid out as these 3 elements that have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That the defendant's actions caused the death of the victim, that the defendant's conduct that led to the victim's death was grossly negligent, and then there's this third one, that the defendant caused the victim's death without lawful excuse or justification. And I think that one can be confusing, but when we were talking earlier before we were recording, Bob, you gave an example that I thought was really helpful about like a doctor or surgeon.
Well, yeah, the doctor that's hired by the prison system to execute prisoners, well, obviously, that's lawful to execute the one they've been designated to execute. So you couldn't prosecute them for involuntary manslaughter because they've been contracted by the state to do that lawful execution of a condemned prisoner. And likewise, if there's a self-defense justification that the jury finds to be true. So if self-defense is proven, that's where number 3 gives the out for that.
Yeah, and a lot of people get confused. So you've got you've got murder, you've got second-degree murder, you've got manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. One of the big things that's sort of distinct about involuntary manslaughter that people get hung up on is you don't have to have what we would call like the mens rea, or you don't have to have that mental...
I'm a man. I don't menstruate. What are you talking about? So only women can be convicted of that?
Your mens rea, which is essentially just what's your mental state. Do you have this... sometimes it can be described like malice, right? So like without malice. So this notion that I don't have to intend to kill anybody.
Why you just say intent?
Well, I like to use big fancy words, right? So
instead of your menstrual words.
To put a point on this, I have the jury instructions from Jennifer Crumbley's trial, and I'm just going to read these. So when we get to the part on involuntary manslaughter, on that instruction, it says, in count 1, the defendant is charged with the crime of involuntary manslaughter. To prove this charge, the prosecutor must prove each of the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant caused the death of Madison Baldwin, that is, that Madison Baldwin died as a result of storing a firearm and its ammunition so as to allow access to the firearm and ammunition by her minor child. Second, in doing the act that caused Madison Baldwin's death, the defendant acted in a grossly negligent manner. So here we can see the state is pinpointing that their theory of what Jennifer and James did that caused these deaths was storing the firearm and ammunition so as to allow access to it by their minor child. So you got any thoughts on this, just having...
There is one of those charges for each of the 4 victims, for each of the 4 charges.
Correct.
And so there's a separate statement for each of those. It get a little fuzzy on the first part where it says the person died because you did this. And then it says, since you did this, the person died, because that's a one factor in why the person died, but it's not the only. So I imagine in part of the other hour the judge spends reading off things is where the judge breaks down that this doesn't have to be the only thing that happened to cause this death, but this was part of what caused this to happen.
I think I'm following, and I think that makes sense.
Because just because the gun wasn't secured isn't what caused someone to die. Someone has to pick up that gun, point that gun, fire that gun, put ammo in that gun. All those things need to happen. So it's not just as simple as, well, if I don't lock up my gun, simply by doing that, someone will die. But it permits those other things to happen. It permitted her minor son to gain access, but then he still had to go do what he did to make that happen.
Yeah, so, and you're right, there is actually another instruction later on in the instructions that's titled Involuntary Manslaughter, Failure to Perform Legal Duty. It's quite lengthy. As you can imagine. And I'm trying to see if I can summarize it. It's going to be a little bit challenging, but to kind of read some of it, it says the defendant's charged with involuntary manslaughter resulting from a failure to perform a legal duty. To prove this charge, the prosecutor must prove each of the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And so then we get down into the elements that the defendant had a duty to Madison Baldwin. Now, again, this would be Jennifer Crumbley owing a legal duty to one of the victims. The legal duty charged here is one imposed by law. In Michigan, a parent has a legal duty to exercise reasonable care to control their minor child so as to prevent the minor child from intentionally harming others or prevent the minor child from conducting themselves in a way that creates an unreasonable risk of bodily harm to others. This duty arises when either of the following are true. When both of the following are true. The parent knows or has reason to know that they have the ability to control their minor child, and the parent knows of the necessity and opportunity for exercising such control. Second, that the defendant knew of the facts that gave rise to the duty. Third, that the defendant willfully neglected or refused to perform that duty, and her failure to perform it was grossly negligent to human life. And fourth, that the death of Madison Baldwin was directly caused by defendant's failure to perform this duty. That is, that Madison Baldwin died as a result of the defendant's failure to exercise reasonable care to control her minor child so as to prevent the minor child from intentionally harming others or the minor child from conducting himself so as to create an unreasonable risk of bodily harm to others when the defendant knew that she had the ability to control her minor child and knew of the necessity and opportunity to do so. Is that cleared up for you?
I guess, but that's talking about stopping him from doing what he did with the gun, which I guess the way to do that is to make sure he doesn't have access to it.
I think that's, pretty much. Yeah.
When really what a lot of the trial sounded like is they should have gotten him some help or put him in the funny farm.
Now, this ties in too. There's another instruction that requires that the act of the defendant must be cause of death. Now, so this is where this kind of makes things a little more interesting in this case. It says there may be more than one cause of death. It is not enough that the defendant's act made it possible for the death to occur. In order to find that the deaths of the victims were caused by the defendant, you must find beyond a reasonable doubt that the deaths were the natural or necessary result of the defendant's act.
Well, that sounds like the parent had to
kind of be on notice that this was more likely than not to happen.
Right. This is the logical, if I leave this gun accessible to him,
he's probably going to shoot somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. It goes on to say that you heard the evidence that the defendant's son shot the victims. As previously noted, there may be more than one cause of death. The defendant's acts or inactions need not be the sole cause of harm. In order to find that the death of the victims was caused by the defendant, you must also find beyond a reasonable doubt that her son's act of shooting someone was reasonably foreseeable.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's where, when I look at these instructions, the juries in these cases, they got these instructions. Now, could have they just acted on their own? Sure. But when you think about how high of a standard that is, they had to look at all the evidence and essentially conclude, like, they made it possible for him. They knew that there was a really good chance. They essentially, like, if I give him a gun, it's reasonably foreseeable that he's going to go out and do something crazy with it and hurt somebody and potentially kill somebody.
And the argument is, here's all this evidence that he was crying out for help, that he was writing in his journal that he was going to shoot up the school, that they wouldn't offer him any mental help. And then when you get to the day of you were called into the school and they showed you this drawing, which was pretty much, hey, I'm going to shoot up the school, and left him there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think the facts of this case, when you look at the law, that's where, there's this big, there's been a lot of media, which, they're going to capitalize as much as they can on the headlines. The headlines about how this is like such a crazy case, and it is the first time we've seen this. But I think this was a case where the prosecutors said, hey, look, most cases we're not going to have these kind of facts. It's not going to fit. But here in this case, we have facts that we think fit what the law says about what involuntary manslaughter is.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any other school shooting where the parents were in the school a couple hours before the shooting being shown a drawing. It clearly says school shooting to me. It has a gun in his backpack, and neither the parents nor the school seem to be aware of that or think to check that.
And essentially, I don't know that this was proven at trial, but it seems like the evidence tended to show that the parents more or less bought him this gun as a present just prior to this all happening.
Right. Now, they did discuss in the trial that it was sort of his. It wasn't legally his, but he had controlled access to it. In other words, Jennifer said James was responsible for keeping it locked up. Obviously, the jury says, no, you don't get off that easy.
Right.
It's your house, your kid. You're just as responsible as he is. James thought he had it covered by hiding the gun and ammo in separate places.
Yeah. So I think we've kind of hammered out how the law works in this area. The jury instructions are out there, and hopefully that kind of clears some things up and just makes it a little bit easier to understand in this case what happened and why it happened. And I think now we can go ahead and move on and talk about the sentencings. You want to talk about the sentencings?
Yeah, sure. Let's get into it.
I'm reversing course now. Instead of talking about Jennifer first, we're going to talk about James first, because we just got done talking about his trial, and frankly, his sentencing, they were sentenced together. His sentencing produced way more, way more content. We'll put it that way. So I think the most interesting thing about his case is that he threatened the prosecutor. And
always a smart move, right?
Yeah, and he addressed the threats. And now, to be clear, he didn't threaten the prosecutor at his sentencing hearing. He was threatening her, on like recorded jail calls from the beginning of time. And he would address these threats on these recorded calls to the prosecutor directly. And in one threat, back September 23rd, 2022, he said, Bob, you want to read this for us?
Yeah, you f***ing Karen McDonald, you're a f***ing stupid bitch. I hope you're listening to this, you f***ing bitch.
Yeah, and then other threats that the prosecution released in this document in anticipation and preparation for sentencing include some other highlighted comments. Bob, you want to go ahead and take us down this trail?
Well, she's going to be f***ing sucking on a f***ing hot rock down in hell soon. Yeah, Karen McDonald, you're going down. Yeah, you stupid bitch at the jail. Go ahead, record this call. Send it to Karen McDonald. Tell her how James Crumbley is going to f***ing take her down. Yeah, f***ing Karen McDonald, you're f***ed when I get out. There will be retribution, believe me. I am f***ing on a rampage, Karen. Yes, Karen McDonald, your ass is going down, and you better be f***ing scared.
Now, that last one and it was January 3rd, 2024.
Oopsie.
So this is very close in time to when he's going to be sentenced. I can't believe, well, one, this is just crazy. This is the kind of stuff the jury's not going to hear, but man, you better believe the court's going to hear it at sentencing, right?
And they did, and the defense attorney argued, look, he was blowing off steam. He was frustrated, he's angry, he just was blowing off steam. He never said he was directly going to do something to her, and some of those I could maybe say was being a hothead. But
that's one thing. If
when you get down to, you're going down and you better be scared.
Yeah, no. If you're complaining, if you're like, oh man, the prosecutor is a whatever word you choose to use, okay, that's complaining or blowing off steam. But when you're making it pretty clear that you want her to listen and she's going to go down and she's going to suck on a hot rock.
I've never heard that expression, a hot rock in hell.
I don't even know what that means, but it doesn't sound good and it feels wrong.
But you know what, though? And I'm surprised his attorney didn't argue this. There is a place in Michigan, a town named Hell. So maybe that's what he was referring to then.
I mean, that's an argument that one could make.
And they do have some strange attractions in Hell, Michigan.
So, like, maybe sucking on hot rocks is something you do there?
I don't know. I mean, I know they have like
The local pastime?
they have Damnation University,
Oh, okay.
Damn You,
Okay.
and that you can get degrees from
What
in
kind
Hell.
of degrees do they have at Damnation University in Hell, Michigan?
They're bizarre,
I bet they are.
and there's a variety of other like roadside attractions there. Probably not relevant, but she's an attorney. Their job is to come up with the dumbest shit possible to try and make juries believe something they want them to believe. Sorry.
No, it's okay. So, in addition to these calls, there was some interesting stuff in his PSR, his pre-sentence investigation report. So this is a kind of compiled thing for the court to get a holistic picture of the defendant before sentencing. And the prosecution included a statement James had made during one of his pre-sentencing interviews to further back up the claim that he just showed a total lack of remorse and respect for court proceedings. In the statement, he said, my son carried out a school shooting on November 30th, 2021. He was the only one involved. I had no knowledge of what he was going to do or presented with any warning signs. I absolutely had no knowledge that he had ever obtained access to my gun. I did not participate. I feel absolutely horrible and devastated for what happened to those 4 children. I would give anything to go back to do something different that would have changed what happened, which, side note, that's clearly what a normal person would say, even though that's not what Jennifer said at her trial.
All right.
And he goes on to say, I have spent 2 years and 4 months in a county jail. The first 9 months I was locked up 23 and a half hours a day. The rest of the time I spent in a single man cell 23 hours a day. I've only been allowed outside 10 times during this 2.5 year period. I feel the court should allow me time served. So that was his request, was to be sentenced to time served. In another section, James claims that he was wrongly accused and now is wrongly convicted of involuntary manslaughter. And he goes on, Bob, I'm tired of hearing my voice. Do you want to read some of his next statement there about his actions?
He went on to say that his kid was a great kid. He never got in trouble at school, had decent grades, and very rarely got in trouble at home. And when he did get in minor trouble, it was just about grades or assignments he needed to complete. That he always appeared to be a very stable individual. Never did he voice anything to me that anything was bothering him. Well, that sounds like a typical father-son relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And after maintaining that he had no idea what his son was going to do, he discussed the gun that was used in the shooting.
I followed the law and took gun safety to the point as needed. My gun was hidden in a location that, until I found out differently, only I knew of. The bullets were also hidden in a different location. I had no idea how he obtained access till the psych doctor he met with at the forensics facility testified in his Miller hearing for the prosecution that he snuck into my room to locate the gun and then later snuck into my room to steal it. This information was provided in a report to the prosecution in March of 2022. She also concluded that he was not mentally ill, so the reasons I was charged have been concluded to not be true, yet I'm still prosecuted as if they were. The prosecution has continued to lie even after having this information, and they used the information against my son in his Miller hearing, and then I was not allowed to use it in my defense. So my prosecution and conviction are based on lies, things my son said only to his friend, and emotions.
Yeah, so I think to this day, James would say, and has actually used the term, that he's a martyr, and he shouldn't have been convicted of it or even charged with involuntary manslaughter. Now, moving on to Jennifer. Although she was much less out of pocket than her husband, her sentencing was not entirely without some eyebrow raising of her own. Bob, do you want to share about Miss Crumbley's request for how her sentencing should go?
I think the funniest thing about this is that when the headline popped up and I saw this, I sent it to you via a text message. And then about 10 minutes later, I got a text message from you of the exact same thing and realized that the one I had sent you hadn't gone through. But like literally as soon as it was announced, we were both sending it to each other. That was Jennifer Crumbley wanted to do her sentence in her attorney's guest house, and her attorney had offered this as an alternative to sentence.
I thought for sure that somebody at whatever news agency screwed up and that was a typo or whatever. And when I read it, and sure enough it wasn't, I I mean, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, for the duration of her sentencing. In other words, instead of, I think the max here was going to be 15 years in prison. And even though there were 4 charges, for whatever reason, they have to run concurrent or whatever. So it was going to be, the max was going to be 15. And her nut job attorney, in my opinion, this woman's a nut job. I'm not saying she's medically diagnosed as a nut job, but she's out there.
She ain't your cup of tea.
Yeah, right. So this, in what I would affectionately call a nut job, thought it was cool that she could just have this convicted woman come stay in her guest house for however long the sentence was, rather than doing it in prison.
If I was your defense attorney, I wouldn't offer for you to come stay in my house for your sentence.
That's what I'm saying. You wouldn't even, you'd be like, well, we'll try and get you a halfway house or work release. You ain't coming to stay with me for how many years?
And I'm not saying this has never happened, because I'm sure there's some other defense attorneys out there who have done this, but I mean, surely that's not the norm, and I've personally never heard of it or seen it. And
did the husband get a say in this? I gotta wonder.
Well, I don't get the I don't get the vibe that he gets much say in anything, but whatever.
Right.
Whatever works for them. Well, power to them.
I mean, we know it's mama's world. We all just kind of orbit around that, and that's cool. I think that was definitely the case. I would speculate that's the case in this particular house. I don't know. But that was bizarre. And I went to every news outlet and every place that sort of covers and breaks down this kind of thing. All the attorneys that do reactions and whatnot. Because I was looking for some insight. Like, this is, okay, somebody explained it. And every one of them was just like, I had never heard of this. Don't know what to say about this. This is bonkers.
Yeah, it's wild. Very wild. And the state responded as you would expect it to, and said that essentially that kind of proposal is a slap in the face of the severity of tragedy caused by the defendant's gross negligence, the victims and their families, and the applicable law that's premised on the concept of proportionate sentencing. So they were adamantly opposed.
Yeah, but they used a bunch of big fancy words. I think it would have been funnier if they were just like, number 1, this defense attorney is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And number 2, no, this defendant needs to be in Michigan prison, not, Cato Kalinin her way around life with her attorney.
Yeah, I mean, what, just a response that says, this some hot garbage?
Right. Or, judge, for real?
Yeah.
Question mark, big eye emoji. I don't know.
If I was, there's a temptation to just include memes in briefing nowadays. So, I'll leave it at that. Anyway.
Well, I mean, you guys some of y'all are having AI write your stuff now.
I mean, some people do that. It's not good. You should not do that. AI is not there.
There's a few examples of it not working out so well.
Yeah, it's definitely. But in the end, Jennifer would not get to go live with her defense attorney happily ever after, as she asked. And James would not get the Martyr Medal of the Year and time served sentence that he requested. Instead, they were both sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison, and their sentencing took place on April 9th, 2024. Any final thoughts about the Crumbleys, Bob?
So if everything was here, that this is by the book, 100%, they were absolutely guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and this was a right and just outcome. Let's take that as the premise. It has never been, like you said, never before has a parent been tried and convicted of a school shooter child doing what they do. It concerns me that lawyers certainly like to use one precedent and sort of stretch and skew and whip out the thesaurus. Try and say the thesaurus. That's tough.
Is that a type of dinosaur?
Yeah, apparently. And adapt the words and make precedents fit other things. And sometimes they don't always fit, kind of like me and leggings. It ain't happening. Mm-hmm. It just won't work. So there is some concern there. But on the other hand, this could be a good thing. There's been a lot of outcry among the general public that generally, where are the parents? When things go bad, and people under 18, some kids are doing some horrible things these days. There's this the first question people ask among the first questions is, where were the parents? Why were they letting them run around with these people, with gangs and with guns and all this kind of stuff? And so maybe this has opened the door to, if we can't answer that question in a positive way, say, well, this is where the parents should have been, and this is what they should have been doing. On the other hand, I really don't want the government telling me how to parent. So it seems like a thin ice, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's definitely the kind of thing that, people are going to have lots of different opinions on, and those are going to be informed by, how you were raised, what you were exposed to, what your life experience is like, and all that sort of thing. And I think at the end of the day, it's more important that we have an open, educated dialogue about it.
Oh, here we go.
And that we just... Wait, what?
Are we on The View or something?
Oh, that hurts my feelings. You think The View is educated?
I
said open, educated view.
We're going to have a dialogue. Come on. No, because what this is all going to boil down to is how dirtbag lawyers take it out. How they execute it and what they're able to convince judges of going forward.
Well,
I'm not saying there's never a case. Are there some situations where parents should be responsible for the kids? Absolutely. But it's got to be carefully applied, is all I'm saying.
Okay, so if I can finish now.
Okay, go ahead.
Your open and educated dialogue. Here's the thing. So to your point, right, lawyers, yeah, there will be some who will try to stretch and push and fit, those square pegs into those round holes. There's one way around that, though, is, like even in the state of Michigan, let's say the people in Michigan as a whole, feel that this is crazy. Maybe they agree with James and they think this is a witch hunt and he's been martyred and, help us not let this happen again. I'm not advocating for that or saying I agree with that, but let's just say people feel that way. And they think that this has been essentially an unjust prosecution that should have never happened in the first place. Well, the way to fix that, if that's the right word, is you got to go to your elected officials and change the law at the end of the day. Because the legislature can pass a law that makes it clear that, anything, right? You could very explicitly define that, well, if something like this happens, the parents can't be prosecuted criminally for the kid's actions. Or you could redefine it to say, well, we'll allow it, but only if you meet these certain elements or whatever. So if this case is stretching things too far one way, if people feel that way, then the appropriate thing to do after learning and being educated and understanding what's happened is to try to go about legally how to affect the change to move it in the direction that they think it ought to be. But what doesn't help is keyboard warriors and YouTube ninjas just spouting off uninformed opinions about how this is, whatever they think about the case, whether it's great or whether they think it's terrible. It's okay to have opinions.
Well, isn't that social discourse?
It can be if it's properly informed.
Well, how about this? Oh, hell. Social media properly informed, that's not happening.
Right, I agree. And that's the problem. That's exactly what I think.
Here's an upside any way you look at it. Law stuff aside, precedent aside. I feel pretty sure that there are probably a number of people who, by being familiar with this case at all, have probably, and this is a good thing, taken some additional measures to make sure that their guns are secured.
I hope so.
So any way you slice it, that's good. That's a good outcome from this.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. Then hopefully, as more people talk about this, discourse is good. And I'm not saying people shouldn't discuss it on social media, YouTube, that kind of thing. They should. But just pay attention to where you're getting your information from, because a lot of people put stuff out there without thinking about it, without researching it, without understanding what actually happened. So don't perpetuate the problem. Get educated, figure it out. And if you disagree with something, then you know what? Understand what your obligations are in our society. We live in a society that has laws and rules and all this stuff that so many people in history haven't had before. So exercise your rights. You have all these rights that are wonderful. Use them to your full advantage. That's what I think.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us on the Brothers in Crime podcast. Feedback and suggestions are always welcome. For links and resources related to this episode, please see the show notes or visit us at brothersincrimepodcast.com. We hope you'll save, subscribe, or bookmark us on your favorite podcast site and join us for the next episode.